Next, let's talk about consistency in interviews. Being consistent in our interview process with candidates is critical to them having a great candidate experience. And of course, we want to make sure that the experience of our candidates is great because they might end up being customers or partners in the future. So we want to be consistent in how we approach these things. When we think about the hiring process and as a hiring manager, kind of the steps that you go through, the first piece is that intake with the recruiter. Next, we move to the kickoff with the interview team. Then after all the interviews are completed, we do a debrief to review competencies and make sure we have a values match. The biggest key is to making sure that we raise the bar with every single hire. So let's dig in on each piece of that. So first, we'll talk about the intake with the recruiter. So as a hiring manager, you really want to focus on what do you need in the role? What are the competencies and skills that are needed? And what do you really want to build into your team that you don't have now? So where are those holes? And what are the things that would really add to your team? Next, you'll talk about diverse sourcing for the role. So when we think about diverse sourcing, really this is where are we not looking that we should be looking? So a lot of times when we're sourcing for candidates, we go to our same networks, we go to the same sourcing that we always use. And when we try to build a more diverse team, we're trying to think about where else should we be looking? What are the places that we need to continue to build a network, whether that's through our own personal network, and then help the recruiter as well to build their network of diverse candidates. Think about what is on the job posting template that isn't necessary. So you might receive a job posting template that has been used in the past just to get you started. Take a look at each bullet point, take a look at each item that's listed and make sure that they're actually things that you need for this role. The example I'd like to share is sometimes you are told that you have to have a bachelor's degree or that's part of the job posting. Looking at that and determining, is that really true that someone needs to have that degree? Or could years of experience be taken in lieu of that degree? Things like that you really want to make sure, what do you need from the candidate? What do you need for this role? And lastly, when you're talking to the recruiter, the other thing to determine is who should be part of the interview team? Who are the folks on your team and outside of your team that will help to interview candidates to determine who is the best fit for the team and who's the best person for the role? The next step is to do a kickoff with the interview team. And this is where you determine who's going to focus on what competency. And this is, obviously very important as you think about what people are involved in the interview team and who has what competencies or skills. So if you have an expert in a certain area or in a certain skill, have them focus on that skill or competency in the interviews with the candidates. If everyone has something different that they're focused on as they talk to each candidate, that helps to drive a better experience for the candidate. So they're not being asked the same questions in every interview. And it also helps to drive more stories, more examples, more things that you can actually talk about during the debrief to determine who the best candidate is for the role. Remind everyone on the interview team about the values of the organization. This is really critical because a lot of times we focus on those skills and competencies and we maybe forget about the values. You want someone that's going to live the values of the organization. So if they're sharing examples of times when they exhibited a certain competency, a certain skill, listen to the language that they're using and make sure it does align to the values of the organization. Remind them that bias may come up. So we all have bias, and this does come out sometimes in the interview process. Reminding everyone on the interview team about bias and how bias might impact their decisions or how they feel about certain candidates. It's just a great way to remind them and kind of keep them on track as they're meeting with each candidate. And lastly, make sure that they all have consistent questions. And what I mean by that is if someone is focused on a specific competency, making sure that they're asking the same questions of each candidate. Now, again, this means that during the probing, you're going to have different questions that they'll probe into. But to start with, they should have a set of 5 to 10 questions that they start off with that they can ask each candidate. So it is a consistent experience for each candidate. And so you don't run into any issues of discrimination. So now that all the candidates have been interviewed and hopefully you found some great folks, it's time to do the debrief. During the debrief, you're going to discuss each candidate and the examples of their competencies and skills. So hopefully, as each person has met with the different candidates, they've been able to hear different stories. They've been able to really learn about the skills of each candidate to be able to give feedback and say, is this person going to be able to do this role or not do this role? Sometimes during these interview debriefs, the conversation can veer off track and you can start talking about things like, will they fit in? Will they be someone who's a culture fit? Things along those lines. Make sure you bring that back and really focus on the competencies and skills that are needed for the role and how they'll live the values of the organization. Look for bias in the feedback that you get from interviewers. So again, there might be times when folks maybe don't even realize that they have a bias. And so the feedback that they're giving might show that bias and might, come across as the fact that they are biased. Being aware of that and taking the feedback, into consideration, but taking all of it together to make sure you're making the right decision about who should join your team. And lastly, make sure you're focusing on the add to your team. So a lot of times, we are thinking about who can do the exact role, but the other piece is to think about how you can up the ante and kind of up the way you're thinking about your team and upskill your team over time. So if you're adding skills and values, if you're adding competencies across the team, that will just make your team even better and drive more innovation. So that's what you need to do as you're thinking about the process around how to have a consistent interview. Thank you.